Picture our resourceful heroine, Grace Barrett, journeying across rugged frontiers, only to be spurned upon arrival for one reason: she can't read. Despite stitching brilliant quilts and healing broken limbs with her mountain-taught remedies, she's dismissed as useless by a man who wanted a lettered wife. But wait, there's a twist. A soft-spoken schoolmaster notices her hidden spark. While others see only her flaw, he sees potential yearning to be unlocked. Together, they face a string of brazen robberies, targeting vital medicines, forcing Grace to prove her worth in ways no one expected. Curious how it all unfolds. The stakes climb higher with each stolen supply, each broken trust. You won't want to miss the pivotal moment when Grace's quiet courage finally outshines every doubt. So stay tuned for the full story, from heartbreak to triumph in the frontier town of Riverbend. And if you enjoy stories where faith in someone's untapped ability transforms everything, subscribe to our channel. Join us for many more tales celebrating grit, hope, and second chances. Grace Barrett first beheld the grand range of the Appalachian Mountains on the day she decided to leave them for good. She was 28, her calloused hands a testament to years of toil spent alone in the same rickety cabin where she was born. That April morning, pale sunlight fell across the porch boards as she stood at the threshold, two weathered trunks holding everything she owned, some homemade dresses, a few precious seeds from her mother's herb garden, and a quilt she'd spent the last winter stitching. When Grace's parents passed 5 years earlier, the nearest school was days away by horseback, too far for a girl who had to keep the household afloat by herself. So she had never learned letters, properly picking up only a handful of recognizable shapes from a tattered children's Bible. "I'll teach you to read someday," her father had promised. But an injury in the coal mine sapped his strength. He died not long after, and any dream of formal schooling died with him. The letter that triggered Grace's decision sat on her small kitchen table, propped against a chipped teacup. Though she couldn't read it, Reverend Beecham had read it aloud to her numerous times, a man in distant Wyoming. Carson Hayes was seeking a capable bride to help him build a homestead. The advertisement promised honest living, respect, and a chance for a better future. In a flurry of courage, Grace had asked the Reverend to write back on her behalf. She described her skill with quilting, cooking, and herbs, carefully omitting her one significant limitation: she could not read. Over months of exchanged letters, Grace dictating, Reverend Beecham writing. Mr. Hayes had become intrigued by her resourcefulness. He sent money for train fare and included an assurance once she arrived, they would be married. For Grace, it felt like an escape from drudgery, from a life that had become unbearably lonely since her parents' passing. On the porch, a wagon waited. Mrs. Lacey, the local postmaster's wife, offered to drive Grace to the train station. "Are you quite sure about this?" Mrs. Lacey asked, gently eyeing Grace's worn calico dress, and the worry lines etched in her face. "You'll be traveling a fair piece to a land that's wide open and wild." "I've nothing here," Grace answered, simply tightening her grip on the two trunks. "At least in Wyoming, I might find a place to belong." The journey was as arduous as the Reverend had warned. Crowded railroad cars took Grace across state lines, the air thick with coal smoke. Nights she slept upright on hard benches, jostled by the train's relentless motion. After nearly a week, she switched to a stagecoach that bumped across rugged trails. Dust seeped into every crevice, and Grace's back ached from the punishing ride. Finally, at dusk on the 9th day, the coach rattled into the frontier town of Riverbend. Wyoming high hills rose in the distance, and a sprinkling of modest buildings lined a single dirt road. She spotted a general store, a church, a blacksmith shop, and a small cluster of wooden homes. This must be the place. Dragging her trunks from the coach, Grace's heart hammered. She was exhausted and travel-worn, her hair matted with dust. She spotted a lone man waiting under the flickering lamplight, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing practical work clothes. Could he be Carson Hayes, the man who'd enticed her west with offers of hope? She took a breath, mustering the courage that had carried her all this way. "Miss Barrett," the man called, stepping forward. His gray eyes gave her a slow, thorough once-over. "Carson Hayes," he introduced himself, extending a hand to relieve her of the smaller trunk. "Welcome to Riverbend. You must be tired." She managed a weary smile. "Yes, sir. Tired, but thankful to be here." As they walked to the only hotel in town, Grace tried to block out her nagging fear. The secret she'd concealed in her letters, the secret that might unravel everything if Carson found out. Grace stood in the modest dining room of the Riverbend Hotel, her nerves on edge. She had arrived only hours earlier, yet here she was already facing Carson Hayes for the supper that might decide her fate. The meal was roast beef and potatoes, a far cry from her humble staples of beans and cornbread, but she had little appetite. Across the table, Carson ate in silence at first, eyes flicking over her in a way that made her shrink inside. He wasn't unkind exactly, but neither was their warmth. Finally wiping his mouth with a napkin, he spoke. Your letters described your cooking and sewing skills. Told me you're resourceful, able to handle the rough life out here, but there's more to it. I recall something about helping with accounts and correspondence. Correct, Grace's heart raced. She remembered Reverend Beecham reading that line from Carson's second letter, needing help with store ledgers with ordering supplies. At the time, she'd assumed it was more about general assistance, not the rigorous detail of reading and writing. I can handle day-to-day chores. Well, she said tentatively, I can keep track of sums in my head, measure cloth precisely. Carson's stare hardened. Yes, you mentioned that in your dictated letters, but can you read the freight orders, pen letters, to suppliers in Cheyenne or Denver? Managing a general store, my store requires written skills. Inventory logs, invoices, stock checks, none of that can be done verbally. Miss Barrett, the reveal of her illiteracy hung like a heavy stone. Grace swallowed, feeling cornered. I can't read or write beyond my name, she admitted, voice shaking. I never said I was schooled, though. I might have let you assume so. I'm sorry if that misled you. But I do have other valuable. That's enough. Carson interrupted, setting his fork down with a clank. His next words were softer than his expression, though clearly firm. I needed a partner who can handle the store's ledgers. I can't do it all myself, not while juggling expansions. This arrangement can't stand if you can't do that. Grace felt the world tilt under her feet. She'd sold her parents' cabin for pennies, journeyed across half the country, and pinned her hopes on a future with this man, all undone because she couldn't read. What am I to do? She whispered, tears threatening to spill. I've nowhere else to go. No money left to travel back. Carson looked mildly uncomfortable. I'm not heartless. I'll pay for 2 weeks at this hotel. That should give you time to find another position. Perhaps the cafe or a ranch family needs a housekeeper. His gaze flicked toward the door as though ending the conversation. I'm sorry, but it's best we part ways now. After he left, Grace retreated to the small room at the hotel. She sat on the edge of the bed, hugging her trunk. Silent tears flowed as she realized how thoroughly undone her plans were. All her treasured seeds from home, the quilt she'd made for her new life, useless now. As dusk fell, she stared out the window at the unknown town. A single street lamp illuminated a figure passing by with a stack of books in his arms, heading toward a small building at the street's end. The lamplight revealed a slender man with a slight limp, maybe in his early 30s, silver threaded through dark hair. Something about the solitary figure so engrossed in his books tugged at Grace's heart, but it was a fleeting curiosity. She had bigger worries. That night she slept fitfully, haunted by fears of returning to Appalachia in disgrace or becoming a household servant in a place that felt no more welcoming than the wide emptiness she'd traveled through. Yet in her deep exhaustion, a small ember of defiance flickered. This was not how her story had to end. Morning arrived with unrelenting brightness. At breakfast in the hotel dining room, the proprietor, Mrs. Alton, approached Grace with a sympathetic expression. Carson Hayes told me of your predicament. Dear, she said gently, he's paid for 2 weeks here, so you needn't worry about a roof over your head just yet. Grace's cheeks burned with humiliation. Thank you, Mrs. Alton. I'll look for work right away. Check the laundry, Mrs. Alton suggested. Or the Carter family has a brood of young'uns. Maybe they need help. There's always something in Riverbend for a pair of hardworking hands. After breakfast, Grace stepped into Riverbend's main street, determined to find any opportunity. Her head was pounding from the stress, but she forced herself to focus. Dust kicked up as wagons passed, townsfolk bustled, and the smell of fresh bread wafted from the local bakery. She tried to read signs, but the letters blurred into meaningless shapes. First stop was the laundry. She ducked inside, overwhelmed by steam and the sound of scrubbing boards. The proprietor, a stout woman with red raw hands, shook her head. Already hired 2 new girls last month. Don't need more help. Sorry. Next, Grace tried the local ranchers at the livery stable. A teenage girl named Ruthie turned from brushing a horse. Work, you say? My pa runs the stable, but we're fully staffed, she said sympathetically. But if you're good at sewing, you might talk to Mrs. Winfield. She runs the dry goods store 2 doors down. She's always on the lookout for quality needlework. Holding tight to that lid, Grace headed for the store with the painted red door. Inside, bolts of cloth and spools of thread lined the shelves, and various homemaking supplies were arranged neatly on tables. A middle-aged woman with graying auburn hair stood behind the counter, helping a customer with fabric cuts. When the customer left, she turned to Grace with a polite smile. "Hello, I'm Martha Winfield, the proprietor here. How can I help you?" Grace swallowed her nerves. "I'm Grace Barrett. I recently came to Riverbend. I was told you might need someone who can sew or quilt." Mrs. Winfield's eyebrows lifted. "Quilting, you say? Let me see your work." Grace hadn't anticipated needing an example. Her best quilt was in her hotel room. I only have a small piece with me." "A patch design," she said, indicating the bag in which she carried her traveling needlework. She retrieved it, a snippet of her mountain star pattern. Mrs. Winfield examined the neat, intricate stitching, eyes widening with genuine admiration. "This is exceptional. Who taught you such fine work?" "My mother," Grace explained. "We lived in the Appalachians. Quilting was passed down for generations. I can do full quilts, clothing, repairs, embroidery, whatever's needed." "Well," Mrs. Winfield said, "I certainly can use more skilled hands. The store's regular customers love handmade goods, and I have a small storeroom in the back you could use for sewing. Not luxurious, but it has a cot. You'd get free lodging and a modest wage for each piece." Grace felt tears of relief threaten. That's more kindness than I expected, ma'am. Thank you." Mrs. Winfield nodded, her tone practical but kind. "It's not all kindness. Skilled quilts sell well, but I've known what it's like to arrive in a new place with nothing. Let's say it's good business and good sense." That evening, Grace moved her meager possessions from the hotel to the back room of the dry goods store. The space was cramped, just a narrow bed, a rickety table, and a single window overlooking a dusty alley, but it was rent-free and private. As she settled in, a cautious optimism formed. She might not have a husband, but she had found a safe place and a chance to use her talents. Outside, the sun was dipping low, painting the sky with gold. In the dimming light, Grace again saw that slender man with the limp and the stack of books stepping into a small building with a sign labeled school. She watched him vanish inside, wondering fleetingly about his life. Perhaps he was a teacher. If so, what knowledge did he impart to others behind that door she'd never entered? Shaking off the thought, she reminded herself of reality. She needed no illusions now, only the will to survive. Over the next week, Grace immersed herself in sewing tasks for Mrs. Winfield's shop. Word spread quickly about the newcomer's delicate needlework, and customers soon began commissioning quilts. Her first large piece, a star motif in blues and creams, sold within days to the local banker's wife. The payment was enough to pay for personal expenses, and she set aside a small portion to possibly buy more fabric. One afternoon, as she arranged new bolts of gingham, Grace glimpsed that slender man with the limp peering into the store. She realized it must be the local schoolmaster, Ethan Clark, though she had never spoken to him. He came in tentatively, removing his hat. Mrs. Winfield greeted him warmly. "Mr. Clark, good day. How can I help you?" "I'm here for the geography maps, Mrs. Winfield," he explained. "We discussed them last week, right you are? They're in the back. I'll fetch them." She bustled away, leaving Grace alone at the counter with him. He offered her a polite nod. "I've seen you around town." "You must be Miss Barrett," she nodded, heart fluttering for reasons she couldn't entirely explain. Up close, he looked younger than she'd assumed. Lines of thought creased his brow, and a hint of silver at his temples gave him a dignified air. "Yes, sir, I work here." Mrs. Winfield took me on. "I hear your quilts are quite the attraction," he said with a reserved smile. "It's wonderful to see such craft in Riverbend. Many families can't afford fancy goods, but a well-made quilt is both practical and a piece of art." She managed a quiet thanks, feeling unexpectedly shy. Then Mrs. Winfield returned carrying a bundle of rolled maps, and conversation halted. As Ethan paid for the maps, Grace observed him more closely. His limp was subtle, possibly the result of an old injury. He carried himself with a calm authority reminiscent of a man who valued knowledge. When he left, Mrs. Winfield arched an eyebrow at Grace. Mr. Clark rarely engages in small talk. You must have made quite an impression." Grace let out a soft laugh. "He was just being polite. I don't expect more from him." Still, she found herself remembering the quiet warmth in his hazel eyes. A few days later, an urgent call disturbed the store's calm. A little girl had fallen from a tree, fracturing her arm. The mother, in desperation, asked for Grace Barrett. Word had spread that Grace once helped reset a broken limb back in Appalachia, a skill she'd learned from her mother's healing knowledge. The local doctor, Dr. Farnsworth, was busy delivering a baby outside town, so neighbors came begging Grace for help. She hesitated at first. Could she handle such a crisis here, under the scrutiny of a suspicious or curious community? But a child's pain outweighed her fears. Gathering her small pouch of herbs and homemade remedies, she rushed to the family's homestead. The break was nasty, bone nearly protruding. The girl, delirious with pain, calmly Grace instructed them to boil water for clean cloths and used her herbal compress to reduce swelling. Ethan Clark appeared on the scene, having heard the commotion. "What can I do?" he asked with quiet urgency. "I need you to hold her steady while I set the bone," Grace responded. And so he did, bracing the girl's shoulders, while Grace deftly repositioned the broken bone, then applied a stiff bandage. The girl screamed, but soon after was still exhaustion overtaking her. Grace guided the mother on how to use willow bark, tea for pain relief. The tension in the room eased as the child's color returned. Stepping outside afterward, Grace found Ethan waiting. He looked both relieved and impressed. "You managed that as skillfully as any trained nurse I've seen," he said. "Where did you learn such healing methods?" "My mother taught me," Grace said softly. "In the Appalachians, we had no doctor. We learned from observation from older women who knew nature's cures." He nodded, genuine admiration shining in his eyes. "This town can only benefit from your knowledge. Thank you for saving that little girl from worse injury." She couldn't articulate the swirl of emotion she felt. Relief, pride, and a lingering sense of self-doubt that always threatened at the edges. The silent fear that her illiteracy might overshadow her talents. "I only did what I could," she murmured. Yet that evening the entire family praised Miss Barrett's healing hands, and word soon spread. In the following days, more townsfolk approached her for remedies. Farnsworth, initially skeptical, actually started asking Grace's advice on local herbs, acknowledging that her mountain-grown knowledge complemented his formal training. Amid this newfound acceptance, Grace still felt incomplete. That hole, her inability to read, remained. Every time she saw her name scrawled on a ledger or recognized letters on signs, she couldn't fully decode a pang shot through her. If only she could master the skill that had cost her marriage prospects. Yet she dared not ask for help, uncertain where to even begin. A month after her arrival, Grace was fully settled into the back room of Mrs. Winfield's shop. She spent her days at a small wooden table near the window, sewing quilts in patterns that dazzled the townsfolk. People poked their heads in just to see the swirling star designs or her meticulously sewn Dresden plates. In the evening, she sometimes roamed Riverbend's single dirt street, watching the lamplights flicker behind house windows, listening to the quiet hum of a small frontier town. One such evening, she noticed a gentle light emanating from the schoolhouse. The door was ajar, and inside Ethan Clark sat grading papers by lantern glow. Something compelled her forward. She peered from the threshold, nerves dancing in her stomach. Then Ethan looked up, mild surprise flashing on his face. "You're out late," he said, marking his place in a stack of essays. "Come in if you like, I'm just finishing." She hesitated. "I don't want to intrude." He gestured for her to enter. "It's no intrusion. I could use a break from these arithmetic quizzes." Stepping inside, Grace breathed in the faint scent of chalk dust and old wood. Rows of benches faced a large blackboard and shelves brimmed with books, intimidating volumes she couldn't read. She tried to calm her racing heart as she approached his desk, remembering her vulnerability and the humiliating memory of Carson's rejection. "How's the girl with the broken arm?" Ethan asked gently. "Mary Carter." "Was it?" "She's healing fine," Grace replied. "Doc Farnsworth said the set was perfect. She'll have full use of her arm once it mends." "Excellent." He pushed aside a speller book. "You truly have a gift, Grace. The entire town knows it now." She flushed at the compliment. "I do what I can. Nothing special, just what I learned in the mountains." He shook his head in disagreement. "Knowledge is rarely nothing special, especially knowledge that helps people. I saw you handle that crisis with skill and calm. That's an education in itself." The conversation lulled. Grace toyed with the edge of a battered primer on the desk, the letters swirling in her mind, meaningless yet tantalizing. She sensed Ethan noticing her discomfort. "Would you like to see some of these books up close?" he offered. "They're mostly for children, but they're the foundation of what I teach," she swallowed. Part of her longed to hold one to test the shapes of letters. Another part dreaded revealing her ignorance. She hesitated, then took a breath, recalling Carson's condemnation. If she was to move forward, she had to face her flaw head on. "I can't read," she whispered. Meeting his gaze, Ethan's expression held compassion. not pity. I suspected. Or rather, I noticed you never looked at the posted notices and you asked the shop customers to read certain labels for you. She felt her cheeks burn. I'm sorry if it seemed I was hiding something from you or the town. There's no shame in not having had the opportunity to learn, he said softly. Have you ever considered trying now? Her stomach twisted. Carson Hayes said, learning takes years and I'm too old. And to be honest, it terrifies me. Where would I even begin? Ethan closed the speller and folded his hands. You'd begin like any student at the beginning. Letters sound simple words if you're open to the idea. I would gladly teach you. Even an adult can learn to read, given time and dedication. A spark of hope ignited battling her deep insecurities. Why would you do that for me? He smiled, a quiet warmth radiating from him. I'm a teacher, Grace. It's what I do. And if I can help someone who's already proven she has a remarkable mind, then it's an honor. You're quick at pattern recognition. Look at your quilting. That same skill set can apply to letters. Her eyes stung with tears. She fought to hold back. I'd like that if you truly mean it. I want to read. Then we'll start tomorrow evening once I've dismissed the school children. Ethan said, his smile widening. 1 hour at a time in this very room. Let's see what wonders you can unlock. Standing in that small schoolhouse, Grace felt a silent vow forming in her heart. She would seize this chance, no matter how hard or daunting. She would not let her illiteracy define her future. From that day on, a quiet transformation took root in Grace's life. Her routine expanded. Mornings and afternoons were for sewing and helping Mrs. Winfield manage the surge in quilt orders. But come evening, she stepped into the one-room schoolhouse where Ethan Clark waited with a stack of beginner primers and fresh chalk for the blackboard. She sat in a child's bench, feeling both excitement and nerves. Ethan would demonstrate, let her shapes have her trace them on a slate, and then gently correct her form, her hand cramped, unaccustomed to such fine motor tasks for writing. But gradually she found the patterns in letters, noticing how each shape corresponded to certain sounds. Even more exciting was her introduction to numbers on the page, though she knew them by spoken word and could compute sums in her head. Seeing them in print felt like discovering a new dimension. Ethan taught her simple word problems, linking them to real-life tasks like measuring cloth for a quilt, reminding her how these skills meshed with her everyday experiences. Some nights they'd stay even longer to practice reading short lines from a basic reader. The first time Grace managed a full sentence, the cat ran up the hill. Her cheeks burned with pride. I just read that, she murmured, voice trembling. I read it by myself. Ethan's face shone with delight. Yes, you did. And that's only the start. Between lessons, their camaraderie grew. He sometimes asked about her Appalachian upbringing, fascinated by her practical knowledge of herbs, mountain superstitions, and the bustling life she'd once known in a holler. Overshadowed by ridges, she in turn learned that his limp came from a childhood accident in Boston, where he was born into a large family. He'd studied to be a teacher, but headed west in search of simpler living and a place that needed his skills. Once she ventured, it must be lonely here, though, for a teacher from a big city, miles from refined libraries and lecture halls. Ethan smiled, a mix of wistfulness and acceptance. Loneliness can be found anywhere, Grace, and community can sprout where you least expect it. The people here, especially the children, make it worthwhile. Word of Grace's reading lessons leaked out in bits and pieces. Some who overheard teased her for attending kids' school. But ironically, the same townsfolk lauded her for her healing prowess. The contradictory attitudes left her perplexed. How could they revere her skill in one domain, but look down on her in another? Fortunately, Ethan's unwavering support anchored her confidence. In late June, Dr. Farnsworth knocked at the schoolhouse one evening as Grace was finishing a lesson. He apologized for the interruption, then confessed he had a stubborn patient with a fever. No conventional medicine seemed to break. Could Grace come examine the man, see if any of her mountain remedies might help? She left with Farnsworth, heart pounding, but determined. She used an herbal compress, the same that had once saved a child's life back home. By morning, the fever broke when Farnsworth commended her knowledge publicly at the next Sunday gathering. Grace felt a surge of belonging. More people started relying on her for simple remedies. She made balms and teas, labeling them with Ethan's help. He insisted it was perfect reading, practice writing out instructions, naming each herb properly. Still, a single shadow remained: Carson Hayes. He had returned to Riverbend after a brief absence. Some said he was expanding his store or courting a different bride, But every time Grace caught him glancing at her, she read a flicker of regret and perhaps annoyance at her growing acceptance in a town that had turned its back on her. At first, she tried to keep her distance. She owed him no gratitude nor apology. If their paths crossed, they exchanged polite hellos, nothing more. She was forging a new identity that had no place for old humiliations. As July loomed, the entire town buzzed about a big Independence Day celebration. Dances, public readings, fireworks from a traveling troupe. Mrs. Winfield prodded Grace to attend, but she dreaded large gatherings. Yet Ethan Clark, in that kindly, direct way of his, said he'd be there with the school children who were reciting poems they'd learned. "I'd enjoy your company," he said simply. "Consider it as another chance to see the progress you've made with reading." Grace found she couldn't refuse. The thought of standing by Ethan, teacher friend, and the man she was beginning to admire more than she dared admit felt both terrifying and thrilling. July 4th dawned bright and scorching hot. Red, white, and blue ribbons bedecked Riverbend's single main street, and tables piled with pies, roasted meats, and fresh lemonade lined the town square. Children raced around with tiny flags while older folks staked out shady spots for the speeches and festivities. Grace had helped Mrs. Winfield set up a display of patriotic-themed quilts outside the shop, expecting a good crowd, but her stomach quivered with nerves. She wore her new floral print dress, one she'd painstakingly embroidered, and pinned her hair up in a neat twist. This day wasn't just a holiday, it was the first public event she'd attend with Ethan. Late morning, the entire population converged on the square. The mayor gave a blustery speech about freedom and frontiers. A handful of local dignitaries followed, praising the town's resilience. Then it was time for the school program. At the makeshift podium, Ethan guided his students through rousing renditions of historical documents and poems. The children performed with gusto, reciting lines from small note cards. Grace watched enthralled as Ethan stood behind them, occasionally prompting softly if a child forgot a word. When the applause died down, Ethan stepped forward with a final reading, encouraging the audience to reflect on unity and acceptance in their frontier community. Grace listened, heart swelling as the crowd burst into applause. She felt proud of him, proud that she had a small part in his world now. After the formalities, townsfolk dispersed for lunch and games. Ethan found Grace near the quilt display, his face shining with excitement. "We did it," he said, half laughing with relief. The children didn't miss a single line. "You're a splendid teacher," she told him, meaning every word. Even the shy ones read so confidently. He motioned for her to join him in line for lunch. Plates in hand, they settled at a table under a big oak. He asked about her day, how she felt about reading in front of so many people if asked. She admitted she'd be terrified. Yet secretly she longed to prove to herself how far she'd come. A lull in conversation allowed Grace to notice Carson Hayes across the crowd, chatting with a newcomer. Wentworth was the name she'd heard something of, an investor from back east. She shuddered faintly, recalling how harshly Carson once dismissed her. Meanwhile, Wentworth looked her way, faint curiosity flickering on his face. Then he nodded politely at Ethan, who returned a guarded inclination of the head. "Who is that man with Hayes?" Grace asked quietly. "He calls himself Edward." "Wentworth?" Ethan answered. "Arrived recently, claims to be scouting business opportunities, but something about him doesn't sit right. He's asked a lot of questions about local supply routes, especially medical supplies." Grace's stomach knotted. The mention of medical supplies reminded her of how precarious her acceptance had once been. "Do you think he's trouble?" Ethan shrugged, eyes concerned. "Not sure, we'll keep an eye out." The afternoon events included sack races, apple bobbing, and a pie-eating contest. Laughter and cheers filled the air. Grace found herself gradually relaxing into the celebration, chatting with neighbors who praised her healing salves or showed off small quilts they'd bought. Late in the day, as the sun dipped low, Ethan approached, clearing his throat. "There's a dance tonight in the schoolhouse. Nothing too fancy. A fiddle, maybe some waltzes. Would you consider attending with me, just for a dance or two?" Her heart skipped. "I've never danced a waltz," she confessed. "Most of us learned only by trying," he said, a gentle gleam in his eyes. "We can keep it simple." She glanced around, noticing how many pairs and families were already drifting toward the schoolhouse. "All right," she agreed, voice trembling with a thrill she refused to name. "Just promise you won't laugh at my clumsy steps." "You've seen me limp, remember?" he replied lightly. "I suspect we'll be equally clumsy." Their joined laughter carried them into the evening. Yet overshadowing the growing warmth between them was the presence of Wentworth and Carson, whose hushed discussions and watchful stares hinted that this idyllic moment might soon be challenged. Grace tried not to dwell on it, for now she resolved to enjoy the fleeting glow of Independence Day, even if trouble loomed. Night fell, and the schoolhouse lanterns cast warm pools of light on the makeshift dance floor. Desks were shoved against walls, leaving space in the center for couples to sway as the fiddler and banjo picker struck up tunes. Grace stood at the edge, gripping the folds of her dress. She'd pinned fresh wildflowers in her hair, courtesy of Mrs. Winfield, who had practically insisted on it for the occasion. Ethan found her there, offered his arm, with a small, encouraging smile. Around them, pairs began a cautious waltz. The first few measures felt jarring. Grace missed a step, stepping on Ethan's foot, but she persevered, following his gentle lead. Soon her nerves calmed, and she discovered the slow, rhythmic swirl of the music. They danced carefully with others, occasionally bumping into them, but she barely noticed. All her focus centered on Ethan's reassuring presence, the warmth of his palm at her waist. At the end of the song, applause rang through the schoolhouse. Grace flushed with shy triumph. "I didn't fall," she joked, breathless. Ethan's eyes sparkled. "You danced beautifully before they could share another dance," Sheriff Davis cut in abruptly, a grim set to his face. "Sorry to interrupt," he told Ethan, "but there's been a break-in at the Carter place in the blacksmith's tool shed. This is the third theft this week." Ethan's face fell. Again. "Has anyone identified the culprit?" "Not yet, but some mention strangers lurking. I suspect it might be bigger than petty theft." The sheriff shook his head. "I'd best gather my deputies. Sorry to spoil the dance." He hurried off, leaving Grace and Ethan staring after him, worry gnawing at the edges of their evening. Without speaking, they stepped aside to let other couples continue dancing. Moments later, Carson Hayes emerged from the crowd accompanied by Wentworth. "Heard about more robberies," Carson said, glancing pointedly at Grace. "I hope your shop is secure, Miss Barrett, with all those valuable quilts and medicinal items you store." Grace stiffened. She still carried her herbal pouches in Mrs. Winfield's storeroom. "We lock up." "Well," Wentworth gave a polite bow, though an unsettling glint shone in his eyes. "Curious that these thefts include not just standard goods but also medicines. Yes, I'd hate to see such beneficial items fall into unscrupulous hands." Ethan placed a protective hand at Grace's elbow. "You two seem oddly interested in local medicines. Is there a reason?" Wentworth's smile didn't reach his eyes, merely an investor's curiosity. Frontier towns always need reliable medical supplies. "But excuse me, I see the mayor beckoning." Carson nodded at Grace, half apology, flickering in his gaze, then followed Wentworth. Ethan exhaled. "That man is trouble, I feel it." Grace wrapped her arms around herself. "I do too. But we can't do anything until we have proof." That night ended on a subdued note. The dance lost its vibrancy as news of the robbery spread and folks filtered out early, locking their doors behind them. Ethan escorted Grace back to Mrs. Winfield's shop. "I'm sorry the night was spoiled," he said as they reached the stoop. She shook her head. "We had one good dance, and that's more than I dreamed possible a few months ago." He caught her hand lightly. "Grace, if you ever feel uneasy about Wentworth or Carson or anything, tell me. We're a community. We look out for each other." A small smile curved her lips. "Thank you, Ethan. You've already given me more security than I thought I'd find here." As she entered the shop's back room, part of her mind lingered on the stolen goods, the suspicious interest Wentworth displayed, but she also felt a flicker of warmth recalling Ethan's supportive words and the memory of dancing in his arms. Over the next week, that flicker would grow, fanned by gratitude and a budding closeness that exceeded their student-teacher bond. She found herself anticipating their reading sessions more each day, not just for the knowledge but for the gentle companionship. Yet trouble was brewing in Riverbend, and Grace's newfound acceptance stood on a precarious edge. She had no idea that soon her secrets, her relationships, and even her blossoming confidence would be tested by forces determined to exploit any weakness they found. When the next robbery hit Dr. Farnsworth's small clinic, it shook the town's sense of security. This time, not only money but also crucial supplies of laudanum and morphine vanished. Eager for medical stock, the thieves seemed to know exactly what to grab. Whispers flew that a bigger operation might be funneling stolen goods to far-off camps, or even black market traders. The final straw came one humid evening, when Mrs. Winfield, closing her shop late, was assaulted by masked intruders. She was left with a nasty bruise on her temple, while the thieves rummaged for anything of value. They got away with the shop's petty cash And unsettlingly, Grace's carefully harvested supply of dried herbs, Grace found Mrs. Winfield slumped in the storeroom, groggy but conscious. Panic surged. "You're hurt," she cried, kneeling down to check for more injuries. "I'll manage," the older woman winced. "They stole your healing stock." Word spread fast, and half the town's residents arrived to help clean up the mess. Among them was Ethan, whose face darkened upon learning. Grace's herbs were specifically targeted. "Why would they want your plants?" "Grace," he asked, worry carving lines in his forehead. "It makes no sense," she muttered, "unless someone aims to profit from fake remedies or to repackage them as cures for distant markets. Some of those herbs would be dangerous in the wrong hands." Sheriff Davis joined them, confirming similar robberies had plagued the general store and Dr. Farnsworth's clinic. "They're after medicinal supplies," he concluded grimly. "This is more than petty theft." The next day, the mayor called an emergency meeting, which only fueled the rumor mill. Tensions rose at the gathering, with people pointing fingers at unknown outsiders. Wentworth was there along with Carson Hayes. Wentworth tried to sow suspicion about new arrivals, subtly hinting at Grace's presence. "We truly know little of her background," he mused, ignoring the irony that he himself was a newcomer. But Grace refused to shrink from the implied accusations. She stood in the center of the hall and declared her story. The illiteracy, the journey from Appalachia, the heartbreak with Carson. She ended by saying, "If anyone doubts me, say it plainly. But ask yourselves, do you think I'd sabotage my own remedy stock?" Doc Farnsworth spoke up, praising her herbal expertise, describing how she'd saved a child's life. Families she'd helped and also defended her. Soon the tide turned in her favor, leaving Wentworth looking more like a troublemaker. After the meeting, as the crowd dispersed, Ethan escorted Grace outside. "You were so brave," he told her quietly. "You took power away from their insinuations by telling the truth." She shook her head, heart still pounding from the tension. "I just couldn't let them twist my story into something vile." "I'm done hiding." That night, Grace found sleep elusive. She sat in her small room, carefully writing in a journal. Ethan had given her a personal record of her experiences. Her handwriting was still childlike, but with each line, she felt the triumph of independence. She wrote about the robberies, about the suspicion Wentworth cast, and about her relief that the town for once stood behind her. Meanwhile, in a modest cabin on the outskirts, Ethan penned a letter by lamplight, not to any official but to himself. A private reflection about Grace. Her resilience and the mixture of admiration and deeper affection he realized he felt. He folded it away, uncertain if he'd ever show her. Neither could know that just 2 nights later, the robberies would escalate, leading to a final confrontation that tied together all the threads. Stolen medicines, hidden motivations, and the improbable partnership between a teacher and a quilter who'd each found in the other something worth protecting at all costs. Trouble erupted late on a Saturday night. A stable boy burst into Mrs. Winfield's store where Grace was tidying up. Breathless, he gasped, "Miss Barrett, come quick. Ethan Clark sent me. There's trouble at the schoolhouse. Something about them stolen herbs." Alarms spiked in Grace. If Ethan needed her, it must be urgent. She grabbed her small satchel of remaining herbs, what little she had left, and followed the boy into the dimly lit street. A warm breeze rustled the shutters as they neared the schoolhouse. The door stood ajar, lamplight spilling onto the dirt. "Wait here," she told the stable boy. "If I'm not out in 5 minutes, fetch the sheriff." Inside, she found Ethan sitting at his desk. Confusion etched on his face. "Grace, I didn't send for you." Before she could answer, the door slammed shut behind her. Edward Wentworth stood there, a revolver glinting in his hand. "Perfect," he said coldly. "Both of you in one place. Easy to manage." Grace's heart lurched. She and Ethan exchanged a startled glance. He rose slowly, placing himself between her and Wentworth. "What is the meaning of this?" Ethan asked, voice taut. Wentworth's lip curled. "I've arranged a profitable venture, acquiring local medicinal supplies and shipping them to quarantined mining camps. Desperate men will pay dearly for supposed miracle cures, even if half are worthless or dangerous. Selling stolen remedies to sick miners, that's monstrous." Grace snapped, fists clenched. Wentworth shrugged, revolver never wavering. "Business is business, and I can't risk you meddling further or alerting the law. So you'll remain here until my associates and I are long gone. Carson Hayes unknowingly helped me gather info about the town's supply routes. He prattled on about your herbal knowledge, Miss Barrett, how it made you so valuable. Ironically, your illiteracy first piqued my curiosity. Who'd suspect a woman who can't read might still hold knowledge worth a fortune?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "You're playing with people's lives, Wentworth. Those miners might die from false hope or mishandled herbs. Spare me the moralizing." Now both of you sit. Hands on the table, Wentworth barked, stepping forward. Grace trembled with anger, scanning the room for options. She spotted movement outside the window. A fleeting silhouette, likely the stable boy listening. They needed to stall. Why did you frame me, she challenged, recalling how Wentworth's insinuations turned the town's suspicion on her. He snorted. It was an easy angle, an illiterate newcomer as scapegoat, but the town rallied behind you no matter. I have everything I need. He reached into his pocket for rope, presumably to tie them up. Ethan seized the moment, lunging. The two men grappled. A shot cracked the bullet, lodging in the wooden blackboard behind them. Grace gasped, heart pounding. She rushed forward to help with a quick blow from a heavy dictionary on the desk. She struck Wentworth's wrist, sending the gun clattering under a bench. Wentworth snarled, elbowing Ethan in the ribs, but he was outnumbered. They pinned him as the door burst open. Sheriff Davis and his deputy dashed in, having been alerted by the stable boy's alarm. The lawman quickly subdued Wentworth, clapping him in irons. In the aftermath, Grace bent over Ethan, checking for injury. He sported a bruised jaw and battered ribs, but no bullet wounds. You're safe, she murmured in relief, pressing a trembling hand to his cheek. He caught her hand, holding it against him. Thanks to you again, Sheriff Davis surveyed the scene, retrieving the revolver from under the benches. We found crates of laudanum and dried herbs in Wentworth's hotel room, plus letters detailing his plan to distribute them at a steep profit. He's done for Wentworth, pinned by the deputy, sneered at Grace. You ruined a highly lucrative operation. Miss Barrett, she met his gaze without flinching. I protected the knowledge meant to heal, not to exploit. After statements were taken, the sheriff led Wentworth away to await trial. Townspeople, roused by the commotion, gathered outside. Carson Hayes appeared among them, briefly meeting Grace's eyes with a mix of contrition and relief. His part in this fiasco, though unintentional, left him chastened, and he quickly receded into the crowd. Ethan turned to Grace, lips curving in a wry smile. Another evening, another near disaster. Are you all right? She nodded, exhaling a shaky breath. Yes, just rattled. Thank goodness for your presence of mind and that stable boy's courage. Ethan clasped her hands. Grace, once again, you have faced fear with unwavering spirit. You keep proving that your literacy is no measure of your true capacity. She looked up at him, tears prickling. You've taught me letters, but you've also shown me that what matters is how we choose to use whatever knowledge we have. The next day, Riverbend awoke to the triumphant news the dreaded robberies had been solved, the stolen supplies recovered. Townsfolk praised Grace for her courage in subduing Wentworth and saving essential medicines. The final barrier to her complete acceptance fell. Even the most skeptical realized she had protected them both with her healing and her readiness to stand up to wrongdoing. A week later, with the fiasco behind them, the adult literacy program Ethan had championed began. The schoolhouse hummed 3 evenings a week with older folks who yearned for reading skills. Grace co-taught with Ethan, his official experience merging with her empathy for adult learners. Already a cluster of 10 enthusiastic learners had signed up, drawn by her success story. If Grace Barrett could conquer illiteracy, they could too. On a golden autumn afternoon, Ethan proposed to Grace in a simpler setting than any dance. They were in the orchard behind the schoolhouse, collecting fallen apples for the children's lunch. Softly, he asked if she would marry him, build a shared life rooted in trust and growth. She said yes without hesitation. They wed in a modest ceremony at the church, the entire town in attendance. Grace wore a gown she'd sewn herself and read her vows aloud from a piece of paper she had penned, childlike letters that melted every heart in the room. In the months that followed, the newlyweds balanced teaching, sowing healing, and forging new dreams. Grace's illiteracy was now a memory replaced by her growing library of herbal knowledge, carefully cataloged in notebooks. She found at last a place where her hands, her heart, and her newly literate mind shaped not just quilts, but the destiny of a community. And so, from a mail-order arrangement that failed, sprang an unexpected triumph. The schoolmaster saw in Grace what no one else did, and she in turn discovered that reading words was just one form of wisdom. Their union was a testament to second chances and to the unstoppable power of a mind set free. Months later, we find Grace not only reading at ease, but also co-teaching adult literacy in that same one-room schoolhouse. Her remarkable turnaround, inspiring neighbors who once whispered behind her back. By bravely confronting thieves, she saved precious medicines and exposed their leaders' foul schemes, earning the town's gratitude. Even more life-changing, she accepted the schoolmaster's gentle invitation to share both a home and a future, uniting two souls each shaped by compassion and ambition. From her vantage, the greatest lesson wasn't just reading print. It was discovering how self-belief can flourish when someone trusts you before you trust yourself. As Grace pens her first love note, yes, in her own flourishing handwriting, she reflects on that initial rejection and smiles. It was the spark that led to a destiny bigger than she ever dreamed. What do you think? Share your thoughts, questions, or favorite moments in the comments. We'd love to hear your voice in this conversation, and don't forget, subscribe to follow more uplifting, heart-stirring stories just like this one.